Kia ora koutou, and thank you very much for joining us for this lunchtime webinar. But the first thing I need to say is happy National Volunteer Week. Amazing stories that I've been seeing in the media and on social media from all over the country, as well as us being completely inundated with the number of stories that people have submitted for the map, the interactive map of volunteer stories that's now gone live on our website. So thanks so much for all of you who sent those through, and any that aren't currently up because we had so many. We'll be working through those and adding those to the map as we go. So thank you for that. And the other thing I just wanted to say is that fantastic to see such a great response for this webinar topic, and obviously our awesome speaker, Johann. Please send through any webinar requests or add them in the chat of anything that you would like to see us do in the future. And also keep an eye out for registrations will be open to our Pivot conference that's happening in October very shortly. So look out at the end of next week for those. And Johann will be doing his presentation, and think about the kinds of things, any questions that you have as you go along. You can put them straight into the Q&A that we have there, or into the chat. We'll keep an eye on those. So just put them in and Johann will answer those, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion at the end. Great. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Johann. So Johann and I met because we were both judges at the Just Power Volunteer Awards this year. So I was very lucky to meet Johann there, and then to have snapped him up while he's briefly back in New Zealand before going back to the University of Oxford to support writing the national strategy for recent migrants volunteering that we're launching at Parliament on Thursday. Yeah, so Johann grew up near Wellington. He's a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University, and he's returning there later this year to start his PhD. He's an award-winning youth volunteer, so certainly a great person to be having to talk about this topic today. He volunteered at St John for 10 years and was the youngest area manager there. Big advocate for diversity and inclusion, and we've, as I say, been very lucky to have had him working here briefly with us. So over to you, Johann. I will pass the Rako over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Katie. And welcome everyone. So we're just going to share a PowerPoint. Share.
Okay.
So the topic, in a way, is quite interesting because at the start, we think that there are some kind of discrete special principles that applies to engaging young volunteers. And then the more I was thinking about this presentation, the more it occurred to me that a lot of it is actually just good practice for engaging volunteers more generally. And so you might be asking, why do we need this topic? I think there are still some ways in which young volunteers, in which we can talk about this topic. And I'm going to start by sharing two stories of why I hope it will become apparent why we need this topic in the first place. Before I carry on, though, I just want to introduce this initial quote, which is the way our youth, our tamariki, can shape our future. And so this quote from Benjamin Disraeli, that the youth of a nation are the trustees of posterity, is a kind of good way to frame this discussion, how as young people, we are kaitiaki, we are guardians of the future. And involving us in young volunteering and volunteering in general can be a way to form a link between generations, to help across generations, and to continue this ethos of compassion and care across society. So the structure of the webinar will go something like this. First, I'm going to share two stories, Albert and Rebecca. And then I'm going to analyze these stories and find out what we can learn from them. I'm then going to propose 4 strategic or general principles that I think should be at the forefront of how we engage with young volunteers. And then I'm going to go back to the story of Rebecca and Albert and apply these 4 principles. Along the way, I also share some stories about my own experience, As Katie said, I was divisional manager for St. John, and also with other organizations I've worked with, and how we can analyze these stories and take lessons so that we can be effective in engaging young people in meaningful volunteering. So these two stories, I'm going to start with Albert. So Albert was a young leader in a large national charity. He's about 19 years old, and it was quite an organized hierarchical structure. The average age of volunteers was upwards of 50, and the demographics were primarily white. He was also a full-time student in commerce, and he had aspirations of being an accountant. Within this organization, Albert's main task was running games for the young children, and he was given an iPad, and he basically delivered the program by ticking various boxes and making sure that he turned up every Monday, same time every week, for 3 hours, where he had to follow the curriculum to a rigid standard. So there was no room for deviation in this particular volunteering. Albert stayed for about 5 months, and then he moved on to another organization. The second story is Rebecca. She was also quite young. She was 23, and she joined a medium-sized charity based up north on supporting homeless people in the community. And the charity was pretty casual. They had quite a decentralized structure. It was ethnoculturally diverse, and there were age groups represented from the old to the very young and everything in between. Now, Rebecca was a recent graduate from university, having studied social work, and she wanted something that was flexible and something that she could do to serve her passion, but at the same time pick up some experiences. And of course, because she had no work experience, she wanted something that she could do given her current interest and her skills. So Rebecca started volunteering for this organization in 2012. And as of today, she's still part of that organization. So I suppose what strikes us about these stories is how different they are in many respects. And there are a few aspects that I want to focus on, which you can see on the screen there. The first is around flexibility. Now, everyone has different schedules, and some people prefer to have a rigid schedule. Some people don't. But notice that Albert found it very difficult to commit to Mondays 3 hours every week, because we know that young people have often transient schedules. University semesters change. Our schedules and terms change term by term. And so you may be free Monday in one semester and not be free Monday in another semester. And so this is just being aware around the flexibility that often is required for young people to effectively engage in volunteering. If we look at Rebecca, we found that her story was based more around when it suited her and around when and how she wanted to volunteer. Now that's got pros and cons, of course, and not everyone will like this kind of flexible, almost a laissez-faire kind of volunteering. But offering people the choice and the option is often a good start. I'm going to come back to all these things later, but I just want to focus at the moment on identifying these differences. The second thing, which is very important, is around the volunteering environment. If you remember, Albert, being 19 in an organization with an average age of 50, would have felt quite out of place. Now, there's an increasing perception, and I'll talk about this again, around how volunteering should reflect the communities that we're serving. Rebecca's organization, on the other hand, was quite collegial. She was made to feel like she was part of that organization and that she was within there, whereas Albert was seen as almost a worker and someone you're employing almost, whereas Rebecca felt that she was actually part of that organization. And that's the third aspect rather, which is the latitude of impact. What I mean by this is, for people to keep volunteering, they want to feel like they're making a difference. In Albert's case, I'm sure he was making a difference running these games for young people. But he didn't have the autonomy and the freedom to choose his own games. There wasn't an iPad. He had to run a tick box. Rebecca, on the other hand, could use her skills in social work as a new graduate, she could supplement these with her interests, and she could get the support of those in the organization. And so her latitude for impact, the ability for her to choose on what terms she wants to volunteer and help, is far greater. The fourth rather, and one thing we've noticed, you may have noticed in the story, is around support. So Albert wasn't supported particularly well. He was given an iPad and told to run the sessions. The assumption being that youth work is something quite simple and something that can be reduced to tick boxes. But we know from Rebecca's story that she was given training. They knew that she was a recent graduate, but they knew that she had some experiences that could come in handy. And so investment and support was something that diverged in both Rebecca and Albert's story. And the fifth and final aspect of the difference is around individuality and recognizing this individuality. Being in a large organization doesn't always mean that you are going to be invisible. But it does mean that we have to think more carefully sometimes around how people feel and fit within the wider organization. So we know that Albert may have felt like an outsider with his demographics. He may have felt alone, and he may have felt that he was just one in a million. Whereas Rebecca was treated as a person. She was seen as a recent graduate with particular skills that she could bring to the organization. And so the difference there is we have to reach out in a way that meets our objectives as an organization, but also acknowledges the young person as an individual. We're now going to turn to, I suppose, the four guiding principles of what I think we can derive for organizations to effectively engage with young volunteers. And I'm going to basically describe these along the way. The first, and perhaps the most important, is to realize that the onus is on you as the organization to engage young volunteers. Young volunteers don't have an automatic sense of loyalty to you. It's not that young people owe you just because you're a charity or something like this. And this comes with a few implications. It means that organizations have to physically go out and engage with young people, have to go out and show that their organization can be somewhere where young people can feel valued, where they can feel useful, and where they can feel good. And those three things I just mentioned is important around attracting young volunteers. So if an organization wants to take this onus seriously, then the one thing you have to do is make your volunteers feel valued. The second thing is to make them feel good about the work they want to do. And the third thing is to make them feel helpful, in the sense that they have actually something that can be valued and something they can contribute, rather than something generic that you give to everyone. The second aspect is to focus on the person and not the age. And again, incidentally, this can apply to almost any other community demographic we're talking about, whether it's young people or any kind, or we've just recently worked on recent migrant volunteering. It's to look at the person as an individual and not to see them as one of just that culture. And in this case, it's not to see them as a young person, but to look at them as a person. And there are a few subtle differences for why this matters. The first thing is you have to look at them in terms of the unique skills and the experiences. So Rebecca was a social worker. She had just done social work rather. And she has skills that we can take advantage of. But if we focus on her as just as a young person, then we allow our assumptions to cloud her as a person. We see her as a young person. We see media stories about young people, and we fail to see her unique experiences as a young person, as a social work graduate with unique experiences and passions to bring to the table. The second thing we have to do is we have to put a lot of work into personalizing our goals, our roles. Now, to personalize doesn't mean to write a job description and just put their name and some generic things. It means to recognize that volunteering is about reciprocity. We've got to find something that the volunteer is interested in, that plays to their skills, and something that can help them grow as a person. So we know that young graduates, for example, may be interested in work experience. Now, obviously, in Rebecca's case, this is not her primary motivation at all. We can see from her story that she has a genuine altruistic desire. But it's no harm to try and come up with a plan where we can empower her at the same time as her contributing her skills to us. So that's the kind of ways we can think about volunteering and focusing on the person. And finally, it's around investing in people. So we know that Rebecca, the organization was willing to take a leap. I mean, she had no proven work experience, but the organization took a leap of faith and said, you know what, we will train you, we will empower you, and we'll pair you up with a mentor. And that means overlooking just her age, but being able to see her as a person with unique skills and contributions to bring. And finally, I just want to say on this topic that it's important not to discount young people's motivations and experiences just because they're young. So if Rebecca says she is passionate about homelessness, about curbing homelessness, we shouldn't treat this and trivialize this just because it comes from a young person, or just because we think it might be something that they think is fashionable. Part of this second aspect is seeing their views and their experiences as unique parts of themselves, rather than just focusing and discounting these because they're young. The third, and this is becoming increasingly important, is organizations have to show that they are demonstrating meaningful impact. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, we know that young volunteers are overwhelmingly results driven. They don't want to volunteer for an organization that is not having an impact on some kind of meaningful level. And meaningful level for young volunteers often means things around well-being, social justice, civil rights, or the environment. Organizations in the past have, for example, when writing their annual reports, focused on the number of people reached, or the number of pamphlets distributed, or the number of contact hours. These are, of course, important proxy measures, but we now know from a lot of research that young people overwhelmingly place more emphasis on ethical volunteering, on volunteering that is promoting well-being, championing civil and social justice, and promoting or protecting the environment. So if you're an organization that doesn't show how you champion these, it's very difficult for young people often to find any use for them for that organization. It's also hard for them to feel enough passion to put themselves out there and volunteer. And there's an interesting global movement currently, which many of you will have heard about, called effective altruism. Now, this has got its own faults, of course, but what effective altruism basically mandates is what they call volunteering with the head and the heart. And this means that we have to not only go with our gut feeling about volunteers, but also to think with our brain around what is the most good we can do in our limited time and resources. So organizations, as I said, I'm sure a lot of organizations do a lot of good work, but often it's going that extra step and articulating that in a language that the young people can understand. For example, show them that your organization champions well-being, that it protects the environment, and that it can contribute towards social justice. And if you can translate how you communicate with young people on your impact, then you will become a more attractive prospect for these young volunteers. The final aspect, and there's quite a lot packed into this, is being open, inclusive, and willing to change. We know anecdotally, but also from research, that young people are less likely to follow the status quo. We know that they are less likely to submit to authority or to tradition, and there needs to be a rationale for doing so. And so part of why this is important is it means that you have to demonstrate why you're doing something and why you're doing a particular policy. If, for example, you have a particular rule, then we should explain why that rule is there. If we have a particular policy around donations or around organizational strategy, we should explain why that's the case, because this is good practice for other volunteers as well. But it means that young people can be receptive and open to these things. Young people also care about purpose, and this relates to the previous point around impact. You want to frame your organization strategy around these kinds of purpose. And we now know from how young people consume and participate in the marketplace that they place a lot of emphasis on inclusivity. That's to say, for example, that they want the organization that they volunteer for to be reflective of the society they serve. We saw from Albert's story that it was a majority white demographic with an average age of above 50. There are all sorts of reasons for why this could be the case, but it's a fair statement to say that Albert, being a young Samoan actually, may well feel out of place in this. And so if we're not able to create a meaningful environment where people can feel like it's somewhere they want to contribute to skills and experience to, it's very hard for us to engage effectively and meaningfully. We also know from an organizational perspective that having diversity helps us discharge our missions better. And young people can be part of this diversity. A lot of the charities I've worked with, for example, can attest to the fact that having young people at the service delivery standpoint, at the front line, goes to a long way in reaching a wider number of people. And so there are reciprocal ways in which young people can participate in volunteering. And finally, we need to think about the whole structure of volunteering in some ways. So we know that formal volunteering is on the decline. People prefer flexible project-based volunteering. And some people, of course, will see this as not real volunteering or something not worth investing in. But we have to realize that the entire demographic and the entire structure of society is changing as well when it comes to volunteering. And offering project-based volunteering work rather than something that is regular and enduring can be a way to engage young volunteers in some ways. Now, I'm not saying that this is the answer in every case. It certainly isn't the answer, for example, with St. John, where we needed a regular workforce to fill particular shifts. But it is the case in a lot of other charities and organizations that flexible volunteering in some respect, or project-based volunteering, can be more appealing to young people. Often young people have a strong interest, have a particular passion, but they don't always have the time amidst university and schooling. And so offering project-based volunteering where they can do this during the school holidays or the summer holidays can be a way to meaningfully engage these young people in a way that allows them to contribute to your organization, but also means that they can continue with their lives. So these four guiding principles may be a bit abstract, but I do want to then look at how we might see this aspect to Rebecca and Albert. Now, I've been going along the way, of course, I've been talking along the way around how these guidelines will apply. But the key question, I suppose, that we all need to ask is it better to be an organization of Alberts or Rebeccas? Now, I'd frame this in such a way that perhaps we're going to go for Rebecca. But of course, it's not that simple because there are lots of organizations in between. And I won't deny that both these organizations do some fantastic work. But what always needs to be at the forefront of us thinking about volunteering what needs to be at the forefront is to focus, as I said, on the individual and to place the onus on organizations to say, what can we do as organizations to make our environment appealing for young people to contribute their skills and experiences? And that simple question, as I said, can be applied to just about every other demographic of volunteering as well. To always ask ourselves, what do we have to do as an organization, remembering that the onus is on the organization? What can the organization do to make their environment more inviting to volunteers to meaningfully contribute? So I hope that's helpful. What we've done here in this case is, instead of presenting a research dense presentation, we've gone for something a bit different this time. And this is to draw on anecdotes and stories and some experiences rather than around full research. So I do invite any questions now as well. So we'll take some time answering those. And people have sent through a few questions as well already, so we can also answer those along the way. I don't think they're ready.
Okay. Thank you, Johann. That's so interesting. Actually, I really enjoyed going through some actual case studies of young people and their experiences, and then thinking about how that fits in, because that's what we're talking about. It's actual interactions with individual and groups of young people when we're talking about people getting involved in volunteering. So thank you for that. And I remembered that at the beginning I didn't introduce myself. So if anyone doesn't know who I am, then I'm Katie Bruce, and I run Volunteering New Zealand. So I, and I apologise for my cough, I wanted to just pick up on a couple while people are busy putting their questions in. So please feel free to ask Johann anything that you would like to know about. I just wanted to sum up a couple of things, because I really loved what you said about young people being kaitiaki of the future. And I think that that is so important, because so often, and that actually gives young people mana, it recognises the contribution that they have to give, not only in the future, but actually as young people right now. And I think that we make a mistake if we only think of them in terms of the potential that they might one day realise, when actually there are young people doing the most amazing things all over the country right now. I was at the Minister of Health Volunteer Awards yesterday, and there were some incredible young people who got awards for things that you think you wouldn't dream of achieving in your whole lifetime, actually. And Johann was a previous winner of that award. So I also really liked what you said about volunteering bringing different generations together. And I think that in this world where we're often so disconnected, it's actually those intergenerational connections that is something that volunteering really can bring, where you often don't find that in many other places. So I think that that's really awesome.
And I suppose it's interesting to think about what we mean by volunteering being this bridge. And there's two aspects. The first, as I said, is that when we're a volunteer working with, for lack of a better word, clients or recipients of volunteering, that's one way young people can link with these people. The second way volunteering can link generations is how we are united by a single cause. So, old and young can unite in the same hall, in the same organization, when they otherwise wouldn't meet. But because of this shared cause or shared organization, then it does bring them together. So those are just two sort of simple mechanisms in which we can think about this bridge between the generations.
Great. So we don't, remember, if you do have something that you want to ask, please put it in. Currently, we don't have any questions waiting, which means that we've solved youth volunteering, which is awesome in 40 minutes, half an hour. There we go. I'm sure that there are some.
I did get one question by email just earlier. So the question was, why do all organizations need to include young volunteers, or only specific ones?
Good question.
And I think this is an excellent question. I think absolutes are not usually very good in this case. But what I would say is, if you think that you're an organization that doesn't need young volunteers, the first thing is to rethink this question and to rethink again. Because to take another example from my experience, we look at St. John Ambulance. If someone asks, does St. John Ambulance need young volunteers? A lot of people would say no. We have adult ambulance officers. But if you think about this question again more deeply, we know that young people have a lot to contribute in this field. Some of them are actually student doctors, for example, student paramedics. Some of them bring a different kind of energy, bring a different perspective, especially around mental health. And so actually, when you ask the question, do I really need volunteers? Do I really need young volunteers? And you come to the conclusion of no. I'm not saying that that's not the right answer, but I'm saying that you should think about it very carefully, because often what strikes us at first as not needing young volunteers can actually be somewhere where they can contribute something significant to your organization.
Okay, so we have a question here. Oh, we have a couple of questions. Oh, quite a few. Okay. So, yeah, this is a good one. So, a good one from Cheryl saying we have a large number of young people, 13 to 18-year-olds, who register to volunteer. However, we're finding that a lot of NGOs won't take them on because of their age. And how can you support NGOs to become more youth-friendly and accepting of this age group, because we know they have a lot to offer?
Yeah. So I think this is a very good question. And I'll start with a personal story. So I was a divisional manager for St. John. And our volunteering age starts from 6 years old. So we have people who are 6 years old, 6-year-old, working in first aid. Now this might strike some as a bit silly, but actually these young people have a lot to offer. They learn about calling the ambulance, about putting band-aids on, about basic first aid. And this is very powerful life skills, even being able to call an ambulance. So how can we deal with this? Well, firstly, we need the infrastructure. And what I mean by this is, you need to actually make sure that you meet the regulatory standards. So a lot of people who work directly with young people need a police clearance. They need to have undertaken a child protection or child safety course. And this can create some barriers for a lot of organizations. So actually, what Cheryl is saying, a lot of organizations don't take young people because they don't have the capacity to undertake extensive vetting and training of the leaders who are going to be working in contact with these young children. So the first stage there is often the barrier is about organizational infrastructure and personnel and having that kind of enforcement. The second thing, a more concrete answer of what you can do is, often a lot of organizations are scared of incompetence, or they're scared that young people don't know what to do. And I think there are two responses to this, or there are more than two, but two main ones. The first is to make the onus on you to train these young people. And one thing you can do is to actually pair them up with each other, and pair them together with, for example, you can have group volunteering. Often when we have group volunteers, say 5 young people with 2 non-young people, that allays a lot of fears a lot of the time. And it can be a good way for young people to engage in volunteering without you necessarily putting all that pressure on them straight away. So that kind of approach is often helpful. And the second thing I was going to say was, we do again have to think a bit critically about how we label this, right? So a lot of people tell me that we don't want to engage young people because they're incompetent. And I might be slightly facetious here, but we reverse the question. Can you think of a case scenario where someone is not young and incompetent, and where someone is young and is competent? So this is not meant to be a foolproof test, but it is a test of how we should think about volunteering with young people, and how we should force ourselves to think critically and consistently. And when we have a stereotype about young people, we should question whether that's founded, and also reflect on correlative cases where it is not the case that that's true. So yeah, I think infrastructure, group volunteering with young people, and then working on our thinking. Those would be my 3 advice to Cheryl for those organizations who aren't willing to take young volunteers.
Yeah, and often young people will just go and set up their own thing if they can't find something that's, there's no guarantee, there's no, requirement for young people to volunteer in your particular organisation. They're amazing youth movements that have been set up. So we do have a number of questions now. Thank you very much, everyone. Okay, so you mentioned creating a meaningful environment for young people. What does that look like to you?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So the word meaningful volunteering is something we used actually in our recent migrant strategy. And what this means is, on a very crude example, one crude example is having people in cleaning jobs or in menial administrative tasks that are obviously not making the most of their skills. So we see this in some organizations, I'm sorry to say, who engage very young volunteers in shelf stacking. in washing vehicles, in vacuuming the carpet. Now, these are absolutely important things, but if you are allocating these tasks purely to young volunteers or to other kinds of volunteers because we think they're not going to question doing that, then that's the wrong approach. So this is the kind of extreme of what I mean. On the other side of what real meaningful volunteering looks like, it means engaging with young people as equals. It means that we recognize them as people who can, as agents who can contribute something actively and who we can learn things from, and who we can teach something to, of course. It goes both ways. But if I had to summarize this in one sentence, it means the meaningful volunteering is where we acknowledge the skills, needs, and experiences of young volunteers, and where we make them feel valued in a reciprocal, egalitarian relationship. That's a bit of a mouthful, but that's what meaningful volunteering looks like.
Awesome. So thank you for your question, Sam, who says, I really enjoyed your kōrero on guiding principles. In rethinking our volunteering strategy, do you think focusing on youth needs to sit separately, or would you take an approach with young people in mind to suit all volunteers?
So thank you, Sam. This is a great question. So we had this, this is always a question when we're doing something called targeted interventions versus universal interventions. So there's always this debate of, do we need something that is universal, or do we need something that's targeted? Because you'll notice a kind of tension with my presentation, which I'm aware of, which is that if we're trying to incorporate young people, why are we trying to take them apart and saying young volunteers? Why not just all volunteers? And I suppose the answer is that in an ideal world, we would all just be volunteers. There wouldn't be young volunteers. But until we get there, we have to realize that barriers for volunteering are different depending on what demographic you're from. So we know, for example, that disabled people find it harder to volunteer. We know that young people face unique barriers, and so do recent migrants and all sorts of other demographics. Now, do we want to say that they're disabled volunteers or just volunteers? Of course we want to say they're just volunteers. But what focusing on this issue does is it means we address head on the fact that these barriers are not distributed fairly and proportionately, and that some people face unique challenges, and that it's up to us as a sector and as an organization and as young people actually to overcome these barriers. So to answer Sam's question, in an ideal world, I would hope that we won't need a youth strategy. We would just need a volunteering strategy. But to get there, we need a specific strategy that feeds into the overall strategy to show that young people do face these barriers, but that they shouldn't.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so we've also got Charlie's got a very broad topic around thoughts, comments around volunteering, civic engagement and voting, democratic participation. Keen for your thoughts on how they all link up.
So also Charlie was asking my field of study, so
yes.
That links in. So I'm a philosopher by training. I also did public health for my undergrad, and I now work in moral and political philosophy, basically around, in a way, civic engagement, but around immigration and around global justice. So to answer Charlie's question, actually, let me just have a look at the question again, for lots of strands. So a prelude to my answer is, I'm very big on expanding the boundaries of our civic engagement. So I think that this is anecdotal, of course, but a lot of New Zealanders we find often focus on particular groups of communities or particular issues. I'm quite passionate about expanding this kind of moral community and saying, actually, what matters is that we're part of this global world. And so issues like refugee rights and global environmental crises, these are all relevant to us, even if they're not affecting us personally. So what does civic engagement look like to me? It looks to me that we go beyond our immediate compatriots, we expand our moral dimensions, and we look beyond the world. Now that might sound all vague, but it just means that when we're evaluating where we volunteer, We shouldn't limit ourselves to just our neighbors or our community. We should look at organizations as well that are global in scope. So if I were looking up at a charity, I would also look at how they're doing in terms of the world stage. I wouldn't limit myself to just something they're doing in one particular sphere. Democratic participation. Yeah, I mean, we know that young people have lower rates in general of democratic participation. Now, that doesn't mean, by the way, that they're not engaged in politics. We know that that's not true. We know that young people are overwhelmingly political. But it might also mean that some of the structures around voting, for example, the ballot boxes, might be in need of a rethink. So online voting is one example.
I think a really good example of that is the rise, say, of an organisation like Action Station. And if you haven't heard of them, what they do is that they build a platform for people-powered change, so people can set up their own petitions, and what they do is they ask their community, and they're community-driven around the issues that they put forward, that they ask people to take little social actions. So you could say that actually that's on the continuum of volunteering. So it's doing more than you have to for something that you care about, which might be signing a petition, it might be ringing up your MP, it might be going out and finding out more about this, or supporting somebody else to do that sort of thing. And I think that there's a lot that we could learn in volunteering more generally about the different ways that people want to engage around issues, not necessarily around organisations.
And actually that's a nice link, because also in relation to Charlie's question, I wrote a blog post for Volunteering New Zealand recently around how volunteering should be political and can be powerful. And we know, for example, that young people are a lot of time engaged in political activism. Now, I would consider that volunteering. I think Katie would as well. A lot of people wouldn't. So I think part of also, we're coming to a stage where we do have to think about what it means to volunteer. I mentioned the collapse of formal volunteering into flexible volunteering. I think we also have to think about whether some kinds of things that young people do are actually volunteering. So that's another problem. When we have stats that say young people are not as engaged in volunteering, that's based on a particular framing of how we define volunteering. So it's not always accurate. And that means that we have to think also what we mean by volunteering when we say young people are not engaged in volunteering.
But it does pose real challenges for those organisations who provide really critical services and are then challenged by this new trend in volunteering, or have fewer people who are interested in volunteering. We've just did and I might do a follow-up webinar on this, but we've done a piece of research across the search and rescue sector looking at there are over 98% volunteers across Coast Guard, Landsar, AREC and Surf Lifesaving. Over 98% volunteers, massively reliant. Imagine if we suddenly didn't have those services. You just kind of imagine if we didn't have those services.
And I think the ambulance is another good example.
And fire. So they rely on people actually who are there sometimes for decades and decades and decades. But they have an aging population, and young people just aren't coming through, apart from surf, which is a slightly different one. But they don't have the young people coming through. So they are really, we've been working with them around recommendations for, how you might go about connecting young people in search and rescue.
But actually that's an interesting thing. So if you look at surf lifesaving, why it's overwhelmingly young people, it's because we've seen shows like Piha Rescue, where we see young lifeguards who are actually participating. And so having young people visible to other young people creates a culture where they can participate in volunteering. So actually, if you're an organization thinking about young volunteers, once you reach a critical mass, you'll find that actually the work will do itself. It'll spread by word of mouth. Young people will feel like they belong, and it won't be as hard as getting started.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've got another question about, some are labeling the Millennial Generation the most aspirational generation of volunteers ever. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there might be a slight sort of bias here, but I think it's a fair thing to say that, as I said, political activism is a form of volunteering that young people are engaging with now. And because we we know that a lot of young people feel like justice, that is to say, the provision of vital goods, shouldn't depend rather on the contingent goodwill of others. That's to say, why should we make fundamental services reliant on donations or reliant on people just feeling good? And so you're right. I mean, I think there are some volunteering is almost at a risk of being totally redefined by the millennial generation based on their political views and what we feel are around social justice. But I mean, I can't give a more, I mean, that's a broad answer I can give.
But I think every generation that comes along, because what we really hear the most about is this the most selfish generation, or is this the generation who doesn't want to give back? And I would certainly say that's not the case. But I think every time there's a new generation, there's these sort of assumptions that come with, or these stereotypes that come along with that, really, and it's about breaking those down. Great question from Chris. How important is it for young people to sit on governance boards, and how can we make it happen?
Yeah. So again, I think there's two aspects to the question. So I think it's important, but what's even more important is that young people's voices are heard. Because if you have, say, a governance board of 10 people and you've got one young person as a tokenistic representative, but you don't actually listen to young people or listen to that young person, then that's not particularly helpful. So I think we need young people on the board as a sort of symbol to show that young people are equal partners in the governance of an organization.
If they are.
Yes. Exactly. But also at the same time, what matters even more is that their voices are heard in the board. And that doesn't always mean having someone on the board. It can mean that we actively champion their voices in more substantive ways. The danger with having a young person on the board sometimes is we achieve our virtue signaling, our tokenistic act, and we think that's the end of the fight. When in fact we know that it's got to be a more constant engagement to and from the board. So to answer Chris's question, I think it's important, but it's not as important as making sure young people's voices and views are heard in a substantive forum.
I think for me, governance is one of those areas where we don't think about young people at all. And governance is really about power. Who has the power to make the decisions about that organization? And young people are the people, young people are the people with the least power in our societies. So I think that actually that's really important. I'm really excited by a couple of initiatives that I know are happening. So Youth on Boards, that was started, Volunteer Nelson, Gordon and Volunteer Nelson has done an amazing job at producing a program that actually supports young people into placements on boards with mentor support as well, rather than just putting young people into a situation of which they haven't experienced before and leaving them kind of high and dry to fail. It's a really supportive one. And there's another one that I've heard about just recently, which is Ka Eke Potama, Rangatahi into governance. And so this is particularly about supporting young Maori into governance roles. And they're doing really amazing things. So I think those sorts of things where it's meaningful and it's supported is fantastic. And I'd love
to pick up on that quickly as well. Katie raises an interesting point that just having one young person doesn't mean you represent all the young people in the organization. So if you have someone who represents the majority demographic, that distorts the view about young people, because, as I said, we have to focus on the person, not the age. And if we have a young person on the board who we then label as the village youngster on the board, that might distort our views around the diversity that exists within the wider organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So we've got lots of things. Okay, we've got another question from Chris around how important is it to offer young people who volunteer some coaching and mentoring so they understand how workplaces function? Because it could be the very first time that they've entered a workplace. Could this be offered by an older person, or should it be offered by someone of a similar age?
So this is where I think, again, it's difficult to give absolute answers. When I took over my division, which then became New Zealand's largest with St John, I was the youngest ever divisional manager appointed. And that had some implications. So, for example, I saw that the average age of my volunteers went down significantly because some people weren't prepared to work under someone younger. And this is, got all sorts
and a lot of other young people probably volunteer with you and they wouldn't have thought about
with other people. So I think to answer the question is a lot of it depends, because some young people might feel more pressured to put another young person with them because they feel like they're a colleague or they feel like they're a friend. Other times it's more effective to get across the message from someone who is younger. And so I think it really depends on a case-by-case basis. But in general, if I was speaking in general terms, it needs to be someone who can relate to the young person, who can understand them, and who will treat them as an equal. Again, whether they're young or old is secondary, I think, to how effectively they can perform their function.
Yeah, and there was something else. Oh yes, from Jasmine. So thank you for the great presentation. How can I help young volunteers engage with other volunteers in the organisation to help create that sense of community and belonging? She says we have regular meetings and I've set up a Facebook group, but they aren't very engaged with it. So I appreciate your thoughts.
Yeah. So this will depend on every organisation, but something as simple as having a shared afternoon tea or a shared morning tea where people can meet others could be a good start. Yeah. So I mean, free kai, free food. I mean, young people are known to be tempted by these.
They do eat, yes.
So I think something as simple as a shared morning tea or shared afternoon tea, where you can bring the volunteers together. And that has the double effect of not only bringing them together, but acting as a kind of recognition step. So when you put on something like that, it shows that you care, that you acknowledge them, and that you're prepared to do something small in return for their work. Apart from that, also, if you stratify your roles by age, as some organizations do this, then rethink why you do that. So some charities I've worked with stratify their volunteers by age group for all sorts of reasons. But you should think whether it's really important to have this kind of divide. And if it's not, then that can be a simple way of integrating these people. And apart from that, as I said, it really depends on the organization.
Yeah, and I'd say that having done this research across search and rescue, one of the things that we asked about was how they wanted to be communicated with and those sorts of things, and the answers were often quite different from what the organisation expected. So really it's going to depend on, if you want to know that sort of thing, ask the young people about how, because it might be that actually they get a lot of the connection with others while they're volunteering and they have a busy social life outside of that, so they don't potentially need that or want that, and that's fine. But it might be that there are other things that they think about, especially in terms of Facebook. So Facebook is not the most popular platform amongst young people now. Lots of young people are not using Facebook and are much more likely to be on Instagram. So that might be just kind of catching up with where they spend their time and how they'd like to connect with each other.
And at the same time, you'll notice I didn't mention the fact that young people are good with technology and we can use this for volunteering, because you have to be careful with these kinds of generalizations. I'm not particularly good with technology, for example, and I know a lot of others who aren't. So it's overcoming those kinds of broad assumptions that young people are interested in technology. I've tried to draw on more research that we can demonstrate, like young people caring about impact. I think we have quite reliable research on this front. So yeah, what Katie says, it's really around asking them as well, getting their voices heard, and asking them exactly what they want. Not just young people also, but other volunteers who may not also have an opportunity to engage with young people because we've never asked them or we've never organized something.
Yeah, and I would just say that if you do want to ask them, be prepared to act on it as well and follow through, and that's always really great. So yeah, thank you, Johann. Amazing presentation and really great discussion, and lots of interesting issues that are raised, tough tough things to continue with. But what I would like to say is enjoy the rest of your National Volunteer Week, everyone, all of the events that are coming up and all the recognition. Thank you so much for all being a part of it. It's been fantastic, and we've got such a great response with the theme. So thank you. And as I say, if you do have any other ideas for webinars, feel free to email them through to office@volunteeringnz.org.nz, and just a few thank yous coming through to you, Johann, so I'll share those with him. So thank you, and
thank you, everyone.
enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.